Hello, and welcome to the Introverted Manager. In today's video, I will show you how to extract data from cursor-based paginated APIs directly in Power BI without utilizing any additional tools or scripts, just Power Query and M language. First, I will dive in briefly into how cursor-based APIs look like, and then do a walkthrough on how to set it up. Let's dive right in. Let's start by looking into how cursor-based APIs look like. This is Postman, what you see on screen. This is the tool that I often use to prototype and work with APIs before I move on to Power BI or some other tools that I'm working with. I use Postman to look into the API structure, come up with queries, and just in general look into it and query the data. If you look on the left, here is a tip for you that I will be releasing 2 more videos about offset-based APIs and how to work with them in Power BI, and page-based APIs and how to work with them in Power BI. Not the topic of today's video, so let's focus on cursor-based APIs. If you look into the address bar, here I have some API I found for Rick and Morty characters. I never watched the show, I know nothing about the show, but this is the API we'll be using today. And if you query the API, let me send the request, this is the response that you get in JSON. The difference of cursor-based APIs is that they provide the usually next parameter in their response to the next page with data, and usually previous parameter with the previous page with the data. And that's what we will be using today to iterate through all of the pages to get all of the characters. As you can see, there are 126 characters and 42 pages. This API is actually both page-based API and cursor-based API. So we can kind of use both approaches, but specifically today I will be looking into cursor-based approach in Power Query and using M language in Power BI. Okay, let's switch to Power BI and have a look how I structured my Power Query to query, no pun intended, the Rick and Morty API. What I like to do first is to create parameter where I will store my API URL, as you can see here. I usually do that not to hard code stuff and be able to change it here quickly, and it will cascade everywhere where I am using it. Next, let's look into the function itself that is querying our API. There is actually multiple functions that are stored within each other, but let's walk through them all. So basically, first thing that I do is I initiate or have parent function that initiates the whole process. This function takes that URL or that parameter that I told you about as a input. You can see it here, fetch data, cursor-based API URL. This is what we are giving the function as an input. And it moves on to the next step in the query here. Next one is to initiate the state, where next URL, next, even though it's our first, is that initial URL that we have here. And also initiate the dictionary where we'll be storing our data and gradually adding more data, which will be called accumulated. So first we initiate this state. Then we move on to function that will be processing our API responses, which is called process page. So this function is basically JSON document web contents, which queries JSON result from the API and here is our next URL, which will be changing along the way, but currently it's our first page, right? On the first run, it's our first page. We get the results from the API response. We create another temporary variable which stores the data from the response and the new data that will be coming later. On the first run, of course, there's just one page and no previous data, but later on we'll have previous page plus new page, previous page plus new page, all previous pages plus new page, and on and on and on until we exhaust the pages. And we're trying to get next page from the API response. If we look into back to Postman, to the response itself, as you can see, there are two sections. Info, which has next and previous parameters that we're interested in. That's what we're trying to get in that function. And also we have results, which inside has array with different characters. Let's move on. Let's go back to Power BI. So here I'm trying to get next URL unless it's null or does not exist. In that case, function puts null instead. And therefore we're setting at the end new state, which is next to URL of the next page, and accumulated data, meaning previous pages plus new data. Okay, let's move on. This is actually the main one, the loop that we're going through until we exhaust all of the pages. This is the function that is responsible for that loop. It generates the list of basically all the pages that we'll have. Although that list is generated gradually, because in the beginning we don't know how many pages there is. Basically, it will be going through the API until next parameter has something there. Once next parameter is null, it will stop and proceed to the next function. But until there is something in URL for next page, it will continue running. So it starts with the initial state. This line will never run again once we finish the first loop, the initial loop, and then it moves on to the next stages. As I mentioned, it goes and goes and goes and goes and iterates through pages until there is null in next page parameter. And it executes that process page function which I showed you earlier, which goes through the page, extracts next page URL, extract results array, puts it into accumulated. And so it goes and goes and executes this loop, executes this function, which gradually populates our array of results called accumulated. Once URL is null, it moves on to the final data. And what it does is basically returns that array of all the results from all the pages that we've gotten. That's what we're getting as the result of this whole Power Query. Whole Power Query query. Once we do, let me close that. That's what you will get at the end. List of records. That's what we want. What I usually do is that I'm not starting processing it right here, right away, but rather I'm doing a reference table from this one. You can right click on the query and make a reference. That's what I did here. And then start processing it. First, convert to table. And once you do, you can actually extract all of the columns from that JSON response or JSON array that we populated. As you can see, there are plenty of columns. What I again usually do in this case, I unclick use original column name as a prefix because I don't need column 1 as a prefix. Less renaming. So let's move on to the next step. Here is our table. And from here, you can do whatever you want. I usually go through all of the columns, remove the ones that I don't need, or further extract the ones that I want, for example, location or origin, and then remove everything unnecessary. Because once you close and load those tables into Power BI, your tables will ever be present in the memory. Therefore, the less data you load after transformations, the better. The less memory you use, the better the performance. So I usually remove all the columns that I do not use. And at the end, I change types. Okay. And if I switch to the Power BI itself, I already have it loaded here. It's a simple table, just for the sake of showing you the data at the end. Here's the data loaded, all of the characters, tens and hundreds of characters from that cursor-based API. That's all for today. Make sure to check out other videos about Power BI on my channel. Next week, I will release another video about working with APIs in Power BI. This time around about page-based APIs. Don't miss it. Subscribe and see you next week.